We shift our focus to the situation in Myanmar. Hundreds of anti-coup protesters in Myanmar poured back onto the streets this morning to protest against the military power grab in Myanmar. Exactly a week after the coup and exactly a week after elected leader Suu Kyi's detention by the military. Hundreds of chanting protesters marched in Yangon, holding the signature red flags of Suu Kyi's National League of Democracy Party. Demonstrators held up banners, including some saying, "We do not want military dictatorship." In fact, we're getting information this morning that the authorities used water cannons on a group of protesters, and this despite the fact that internet was shut down in the country earlier. Internet services have been restored. Over the weekend, we saw massive protests. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets of Myanmar to raise their voice against the military coup. And as people continue to take to the streets this morning, authorities used water cannon on a group of protesters. Myanmar is witnessing a fresh wave of civil disobedience as opponents of Myanmar's coup have called for more protests and work stoppages today. Doctors, joined by some teachers and other government workers, are expected to take part in the campaign. A few dozen nurses said that they were on a strike as part of the civil disobedience campaign. Meanwhile, citizens of Myanmar's Mandalay refused to back down. Demonstrators on motorbikes rolled onto the streets. Large crowds marched alongside the bikers in Mandalay, chanting slogans and holding placards in support of Suu Kyi. A smaller group of protesters wearing medical gear could be seen on the side of the road, chanting and clapping. This after tens of thousands of people joined weekend demonstrations against the removal and detention of elected leader Suu Kyi a week ago. Protests that swept the country on Sunday were the biggest since a 2007 saffron revolution led by Buddhist monks. The complete information blackout triggered by a nation-scale internet shutdown fueled more anger among the protesters. The internet services have now been restored, but it clearly failed to stifle the growing outrage at the military's ouster of Suu Kyi and her government. Joining us on this broadcast now is Professor and Director, Institute of Security and International Studies, Dr. Thitinan Pongsudharak is joining us live from Bangkok. Dr. Thitinan, thank you so much for giving us your time. Welcome to WION. You know, there are certain aspects of the protests that are coming forward this time round. First of all, despite the massive internet blackout or a nationwide internet blackout that was imposed a few days earlier, thousands of people continue to take to the streets and raise their voice against the military coup. And we are learning that this morning in the capital of Myanmar, the authorities used water cannons on the protesters.
This was inevitable. You know, we had the military coup a week ago. And the coup basically was a disenfranchisement and usurpation of the popular will. People voted overwhelmingly for the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi, and the military coup basically overturned that verdict, the electoral verdict. And now with the military in charge, we're seeing scenes from the past, I'm afraid. We've seen all of this before in 1988, 1990, 2007. Popular protests met with physical, brutal suppression. So these are early days still, but we see now massive protests, different major cities, not just Yangon or Naypyidaw, but around the other cities, Mandalay, on. So this is going to build, it's going to mount, and then we will see what the reaction will be from the authorities. We see some water cannons now, but we might see bullets later. It would not be surprising. They've done it before in the past. So I think the situation is very fluid. My big question is, we've seen this kind of suppression before and this usurpation before, but will it be like the last time? Will it be like the recent history of Myanmar, Burma? And this time I'm not so sure. in the last decade, in the last 10 years of opening and reform, a lot of Myanmar people now have a stake. They have stakes in the system. It's for them to win or lose. So they may not back down easily, even though the official suppression will be very brutal. It might involve violence, because these people, I think that they have learned over the last 10 years that the future is theirs to be had.
Right. Dr. Thitinan, Suu Kyi is still under detention. The military has declared a 1 year of emergency in the country. But one important aspect of these protests which is coming forward is the civil disobedience being carried forward by respected members of the community, be it nurses or doctors or teachers. They are leading these protests against the military coup.
Yeah, again, we've seen civil society-led protests before in the past in Myanmar, but this time, what's different fundamentally now is across society. It's every strata. It's the civil service. It's the villagers, the people in the streets, and so on. I mean, basically, you have all segments of Myanmar society now involved, mobilized, galvanized. So it's not just the students like in 1988. It's not just led by the monks like in 2007. This is Myanmar society as a whole. So something for the military authorities to deal with is much more difficult now.
Right. Myanmar has had his relationship with the military dictatorship or military rule. Military juntas have ruled Myanmar from 1962 to as recently as 2011. What's so different about these protests that we are seeing? We are seeing many youngsters out on the streets armed with their mobile phones, armed with more information, and they are unwilling to simply lie down and let the military take their leaders into custody and seize power in their country.
Last time Myanmar was under military dictatorship from 1962, it lasted almost 5 decades before the reopening in 2011 and reforms and some progress, some development. I know there are a lot of flaws, a lot of shortcomings, but this time technology is very empowering. Despite the internet blackout, they had to put it back on, I think partly because the officials needed the internet themselves. Also the technology has a way of circumventing official control, very difficult for them. This time, the protests, is broad-based, organic, and it's automatic right after the military coup. I'm not surprised at all at the protests. I think we'll see a lot more of them, a lot more protesters. And now a lot of demographics also changing. Myanmar is a younger country. A lot of people are coming up in their 20s, in their 30s. They want a different kind of country, not the 5 decades of dictatorship from the 20th century, going into the 2020s. This is the 21st century. They want something better. They want something more. So I think the authorities will have a lot on their hands unless they make some concessions and compromises. The first move certainly would have to be to release the Aung San Suu Kyi and the civilian leaders. And after that, maybe some kind of a mediation compromise possible. But if the military plays it this way with suppression, I think the protests will build and build.
The military has said that they will hand over power back to a democratically elected government. They will hold elections in a year's time and then hand the power back to that government. Can the military authorities be trusted, firstly, in Myanmar? And secondly, international pressure. Has it worked so far? We haven't seen Suu Kyi being released. We haven't seen military giving back power to the elected authorities. So is international pressure going to work as far as Myanmar is concerned?
Well, there has not been as much international pressure that one might have expect. The U.S. has threatened some sanctions, and there's kind of a broad condemnation. But the UN Security Council resolution was vetoed by China and Russia. China is not against the coup per se. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, have been very mild and muted in its response. And then you look at Europe, you look at the U.S. They're not in as much of a strong position as in the past. So international pressure, in fact, is not the leading kind of motivator driver of what's taking place inside the country. It matters. The business sector will be something else. If there's it depends on what happens in the interim. But if a foreign investor is set to withdraw, the economy will feel the debilitating effects. The military itself, they promise to they say that they have 1 year emergency, maybe going back to elections after that. But along the way, in the interim, one could imagine that the military would manipulate and concoct a new kind of constitution. They certainly will prevent Aung San Suu Kyi from running, most likely, and they'll try to undermine the NLD. So it's not going to satisfy the people, I'm afraid.
One final question to you, Doctor, very quickly. We are almost out of time, but you mentioned that international pressure hasn't resulted in much changes on the ground in Myanmar. But what role will regional powers play, like China, India, or even Malaysia?
Well, you can see that ASEAN is a little bit limited in what it can do. I think the key countries would be China, of course, and the West in general, US and Europe. But certainly India has a big stake here because, Myanmar at one point was part of British India, and India is a big giant just next door, nearby. So India is the largest democracy in the world, so it has a certain voice that it can't put to play. And then I think Japan, South Korea, these are, the fight for democracy and democratization in Asia really should be among the Asian countries. So South Korea, Japan, India, if they can apply some pressure, I think this is what the Myanmar people are looking for.
Dr. Thitinan, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your perspective on the ground situation in Myanmar. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.